Please give a huge, huge, huge round of applause to Julian Burnside and Stephanie Alexander. Welcome, Stephanie. Welcome, Julian. Thank you so much for joining us. Oh, I get the middle seat. What a treat. It's a bit of a case of sort of long-time caller, a first-time caller, long-time listener with these two. I've been a huge fan of Stephanie and Julian collectively and individually. I used to be a lawyer, and everything that I know about cooking I have learnt from the Cook's Companion. So thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you for joining us at festival21 tonight. Now, we might start with you, Stephanie. You've obviously dedicated your life to food. What is it about food that inspires you generally and also specifically in setting up the Stephanie Alexander Kitchen Foundation?
Well, I think the short answer is a very long thing. It's happened when I was a child. Food was always associated, in my mind, with the happiest times, with the most delicious flavours, with being with the people I loved, and that it was something that happened every day. And really, the life around the table, I have never had enough of. Conversation, argument, debate, laughter, and beautiful food. And it goes on for being endlessly inspiring and re-energising for me.
So it's, in some respects, it's not just the food. In fact, it's not the food. It's the sort of surrounding aspects of community, food, family, and I know education is really important to you. Are you able to sort of tell us a bit about why you feel education?
Well, I guess I learnt more about the food as I grew older, but yes, it was always about the food. It was about helping my grandfather collect the sweet corn from the garden or plant potatoes or hear his stories about growing things whilst he was doing something in the garden, Mum was doing something else. So yes, it was about food, but it wasn't so much about intellectualising flavour or taste. It was genuinely the pleasure. Pleasure is the key word for me. Pleasure and bringing people together.
And Julian, turning to you for a moment, you've dedicated obviously a huge amount of time and energy to social issues in our community. What is it, if you share with us, what is it that drives you? What's your passion? Stephanie's is obviously food. Can you talk to us a bit about yours?
Well, look, I like food too. And I was going to add one thing, and I think it's the distinction that Stephanie was alluding to. Eating is fine and necessary. It's dining that really counts. It's the sense of community around the table. It's more than just having a quick meal at McDonald's. Dining is very different. But what drives me is a passion for, I'd call it justice, which sounds a bit highfalutin, but just fair treatment of people. I've always been worried about fair treatment of people from childhood.
Right. Can you share with us, specifically thinking about food, can you share with us maybe a meal that changed your life, or a very distinctive meal that sort of is ingrained in your memory?
I don't think I've had a meal that changed my life because, to be honest, dining is one of the very few times when I actually relax. And I'm not going to make decisions when I'm dining. I like wine with food, and I think I'm sensible enough not to make serious decisions when I'm drinking wine. And I'm not going to make decisions to change my life when I'm drinking wine, I hope. But my most memorable meal, by far, was a lunch which Barry Jones organised. Barry Jones is a friend of ours, and Barry organised a lunch, and the guests at the lunch in a private dining room was Barry, of course, me, John Clark, Brian Dorr, Graham Freudenberg, Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser. That was a cracker of a lunch.
Wow. Like to be a fly on the wall.
It was a terrific lunch.
That one.
And in fact, the portrait which Ai Weiwei has done of me, which is in the gallery at the moment, is drawn directly from a photograph of me after that lunch.
Wow.
I'm quite cheerful.
Wow, I'll have to check that out. I can imagine. Stephanie, do you have a meal that changed your life? Either preparing it, eating it?
Well, I feel a bit like Julian. There's no one single meal that I could say changed my life. There was a moment when I was living as a student in France, living in a teacher training college, which was set up for young people who were going to teach primary school. They were in residence and they were approximately 17 and 18 years old, all women. And I had just graduated from Melbourne University, where I had spent 3 years as an inmate, can I say, at University Women's College, now University College. And I railed endlessly and bored everybody at University College about the quality of the food, and everybody else used to sort of look at me as if I was a freak, and they'd say, well, this is much better than boarding school. Well, I didn't know anything about boarding school because I'd never been to boarding school. When I was in France, these 17 and 18-year-old girls, every day for lunch, had a 3-course meal, which was something beautiful, very simple, a little carrot salad, maybe even only a bowl of olives, followed by a little pork chopped with a little sauce, a green salad, a bottle of wine, if you don't mind, was on the table. Very few of them actually took the wine, but it was on offer, and then there would be a fruit bowl for lunch. And I remember just being absolutely amazed that this was a change of values. This was a different thing of values. We had had 10 tins of red jam and an ever-growing stack of white bread laid out for lunches, and there'll be other things. I am being a bit mean. But the assumption that these young teachers in training deserve to have a proper lunch, to sit down in a proper dining room and to have conversation was pretty memorable. And I'm sure it has stayed with me, that memory. And in some way, I feel it's a bit of social equity there, that those kids were being treated as if they mattered, whereas I felt that we were being treated as if we were 5-year-olds.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Wow. Well, thinking about that in the context of that story, in the context of Festival21 and the philosophy being food and our future, do you think that we're on the right path at the moment to a sustainable future? Are we doing everything we need to do to educate children, parents, for a sustainable food future?
Is that a question to me?
Yeah, I think it is.
I believe that the youth is the most important place to start. I believe we have to start with young people. The Australia that I grew up in was a much more limited place as far as people's experience of the wider world, but almost everybody lived in a sort of a detached house. They had a bit of dirt somewhere or other. They grew a bit of silver beet and a bit of mint and a bit of parsley and probably some tomatoes in the summer. There was an understanding that, and life was pretty frugal in the late 50s and early 60s. It was pretty soon after the war. People were careful about how they fed themselves. We now have a situation where everything's on tap all the time. I don't know how many young people really actually experience feeling genuinely hungry. What I do believe is that the program we have developed that operates in primary schools has amazingly effective results in a very short time of changing the awareness of the huge variety of food that's out there in very young kids, by getting them engaged in growing it themselves, in chopping and stirring and all the things they enjoy doing, making their own pasta, picking the silver beet, learning to use a knife effectively, rolling up the silver beet with a bit of garlic, sautéing with some Australian olive oil, putting all that together with the pasta, putting it in an oven. I mean, the self-esteem, the pride is fantastic. The skills acquired are for life, and they are suddenly experiencing something which they've not had before. And many of their parents then sort of say to us with astonishment, but my child doesn't eat vegetables, or my child doesn't eat anything green. I find those sentences quite extraordinary. It's very hard for a kid who's getting one sort of information at school and enjoying it if it's not being reinforced. I mean, positive modelling, for me, is the way for a sustainable future in food and a lot of other things. But if it's not happening at home, we have to intervene.
I very briefly volunteered at a primary school near me where I would go one morning a week and cook breakfast for the kids. It was at the bottom of a commission flats, and they're all sort of newly arrived migrants and refugees. And a lot of these kids would go without breakfast unless we provided it for them. And it wasn't just, some cereal in a bowl. We'd teach them how to make French toast, and we'd teach them a few cooking skills. And it was amazing to see how those children would then sort of teach their parents. Julian, do you think food has a role to play in the social issues you're sort of a champion for? Can food be a driving force in change there?
Well, probably yes, because to my observation, one of the most successful pathways for new arrivals in this country into the community at large is through their restaurants. You know, I remember in the 1950s and 60s when Greek and Italian restaurants became the thing, and the Greeks and Italians who'd arrived after the Second World War sort of became part of who we are. And of course, in the wake of the Indo-Chinese refugees arriving from Vietnam, Cambodia and so on in the 70s, we found Vietnamese and Cambodian restaurants springing up, and that has also helped them become part of what we are, or we have become to regard them as part of what we are. But I want to go back to something Stephanie said. I mean, I'm a few years older than Stephanie, but I do remember the 50s and 60s pretty well. The interesting thing, you're right, there was a certain frugality, because my parents' generation, who'd grown up during the Depression, who'd been at the war, had a philosophy that you didn't borrow money. If you didn't have the money, you didn't buy it. And so everything was frugal. And one of the worst enemies of sustainable anything in our community now is a tendency for us to live on the never-never. You know, our generation who deserve to be castigated forever, we have really damaged this planet expecting the next generation to pick up the pieces and pay the bill for what we've enjoyed. And I think it's terrible, absolutely terrible, because our generation learned to live on future wealth.
So what would your message be to a 30-year-old man who's just got a 30-day-old son? If you could sort of turn the clock back and talk to yourself as a 30-year-old man, what would the message be that you would give to yourself, or someone in my shoes now?
Well, at the risk of sounding like Polonius, it'd be something like neither a borrower nor a lender be. You know, I mean, the idea, no, it sounds trivial, but I remember my mother especially, would never borrow money. She would never consider buying anything if she didn't have the money for it. And we did live relatively frugally. Nowadays, families who are in the same financial position as we were in back then would have a house fully furnished, you know, the latest washing machine, the latest dishwasher, all of this stuff, because they can borrow the money. The idea of a credit card was a real novelty when I started in practice. You know, having a credit card was kind of a bit dodgy because you were buying and having to pay for it later. And the idea that we can use the Earth's resources now and as a result warm the climate to an extent which looks pretty dangerous, that's simply us borrowing against the future. And I hope the next generation does a lot better than we've done.
And my advice would be that you would grow some of your own food, because it's not hard. We're not asking people get frightened by thinking you're actually asking them to produce a market garden, and we're not. I mean, if you're just a family of 2 or 4 or 5 people, you can produce quite a lot of your own food at a very small space, have great fun doing it, involve your children in the so doing, and at the very, very least, support, you know, things like farmers markets, and only buy what you know you're going to have for the next couple of meals. You don't need to have a refrigerator groaning with food that you might not possibly get to for the next 7 days. You want to eat fresh food, you want to eat locally sourced food, and not too much. That's the other message, not too much.
It seems like,
of course, in the 50s, you wouldn't have minded having vegetables growing instead of azaleas, but now you've got to have azaleas and rhododendrons, and it's just ridiculous.
It seems like there's quite a strong sort of parallel between, we heard Nairan talking earlier about arriving as a refugee and encouraging people to share and give food in a desire to build community and share food. If we could all take the leaf out of your book and Nairan's book, not literally, you're not the cook's companion, but figuratively, and we could grow our own food and then knock on
Some of it. Let's not be, you know, I think sometimes people get turned off that message because they think the message is you've got to do it totally. No, you can't.
Right.
But you can, grow some salad leaves, you can grow some tomatoes.
Yep. Yeah, I think there's a great synergy there. And I think that sort of, it's the idea of having, the QC, the cook and the MC on stage, it sounds like a really bad rom-com. But in actual fact, I think your worlds sort of overlap in a really beautiful way. And I think we're very grateful for you. I've just noticed the time's ticking down. We might just finish off with one more question. Who would you most like to share a meal with and why? I can give you some thinking time. Mine would be to share one with you two right now, which I've sort of, ticked that off my bucket list.
We'll tuck in.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. Those tomatoes look really good. But is there anyone that, from any period of time, currently, previously, you'd like to share a meal with and why? Julian, do you?
I think Beethoven and Virginia Woolf would be kind of interesting.
Wow, okay.
I think my mind just goes blank.
Well, you could share one with me, and then we could both tick each other's bucket list. That doesn't appeal to you? That's fine. I'll just
tempted to say Elizabeth David, but I suspect she might have been a very difficult dining companion.
Right.
But it would at least be intriguing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for joining us at Festival 21. Please give a huge round of applause to Julian Burnside and Stephanie Alexander.